As the sun began to set, casting a soft orange glow across the quiet street, a black woman was driving home after a long, tiring day at work. She was used to the rush of a busy day and the calmness of the evening drive that followed. The world seemed peaceful as the hum of the engine and the gentle breeze through the open window filled the air. She was looking forward to relaxing in the comfort of her home, letting the stress of the day slip away. As she turned onto a more secluded street, something unexpected happened. In her rearview mirror, she noticed the flashing blue and red lights of a police car. Her heart skipped a beat. She wasn't speeding or doing anything wrong. So why was she being pulled over? She glanced at the rearview mirror again to make sure it was her car the officers were stopping. Sure enough, the police car slowed down and positioned itself behind her. The woman took a deep breath, trying to remain calm. She pulled over to the side of the road, turning off the engine as she waited for the officers to approach. It was an ordinary routine stop, she assumed, but even so, she could feel a subtle tension in the air. It wasn't the first time she had been pulled over, but something about this felt different. The officers stepped out of their car and walked toward her. She couldn't help but notice the way they looked at her. There was a certain air of assumption in their steps. They didn't know who she was, but the way they approached made her feel as though they had already formed their opinions about her. They seemed confident, perhaps even a little too comfortable in their roles, as if they expected the stop to go according to their plan. As they reached her window, the officers greeted her and asked for her license and registration. The woman complied, keeping her hand steady as she handed over the documents. She could sense the subtle judgment in their eyes, their questioning tone, and the way they studied her face. They didn't know who she was. To them, she was just another person on the road, a driver to stop and question. The first officer spoke in a tone that was professional, but there was something about his voice that made her feel like she was being treated differently. His questions were routine, but she could feel the weight of his assumptions. Maybe it was because she was a woman, or maybe it was because she was black. Whatever it was, she had a sense that the officers were sizing her up in a way that didn't feel right. But she didn't respond with anger. She stayed calm, her eyes fixed on the officer as she answered his questions politely. She knew how important it was to keep things civil, even when the situation seemed unfair. Little did the officers know, the woman sitting in front of them was about to turn this routine traffic stop into a moment that would surprise them all. But for now, she kept her composure, waiting for the moment when she would reveal who she really was. The officers continued to speak with her, their words falling on her ears like the ticking of a clock. Everything felt normal, even as she felt the growing tension between them. She couldn't help but wonder what would happen when they finally learned the truth. The officers exchanged a quick glance before the second officer spoke up, his voice firm but polite. He asked the woman more questions about her driving, checking her registration and insurance papers. She could tell he wasn't suspicious of anything in particular, but his tone had an edge of authority, like he was trying to assert control over the situation. The woman responded calmly, as she always did, handing over the necessary documents without hesitation. The officers kept their eyes on her, scanning her movements, as if waiting for her to make a mistake. She noticed that the way they looked at her was different from how they would look at any other driver. It was subtle, but it was there. A look that she had seen before, a look that carried unspoken assumptions about who she was. Maybe they thought she was just another driver trying to slip through the cracks, someone who wouldn't challenge their authority. They seemed so confident in their roles that they probably hadn't even considered that she might be more than just a regular citizen on the road. The woman felt her patience stretching thin, but she kept her emotions in check. She knew all too well that she had to remain composed in these situations. As she handed over her license, she noticed the officers didn't seem particularly interested in getting to know her as a person. They weren't asking questions beyond the basics, like where she was coming from or where she was headed. It was clear to her that they were focused more on their duty than on making a connection. To them, she wasn't a person, just another driver they had to deal with. The second officer seemed to relax a little as he took a step back. He must have thought everything was fine, that this was just another stop they could check off their list. She could tell they were ready to send her on her way with nothing more than a warning. Maybe they assumed she was a little nervous, just like many other drivers they pulled over. It wasn't unusual for people to be jittery when an officer approached their car, especially at night. But she wasn't nervous, not at all. She had been in enough situations like this to know how to handle herself. As the officers continued to talk to each other, she couldn't help but feel a bit of frustration building up inside her. They hadn't even considered that she might be someone of importance. They hadn't bothered to pay attention to the details. How could they have missed it? The badge on her belt, the confident way she held herself, the aura of authority she exuded. It should have been enough for them to realize she wasn't just anyone. But no, they hadn't noticed. She was still just another black woman in their eyes, someone they could assume things about based on their own biases. They hadn't thought twice about who she was, or where she came from. It was all routine for them, until now. The woman took another steady breath. She knew what she had to do. She had to tell them. And soon, she would make them realize just who they were dealing with. But for now, she waited. She waited for the right moment, keeping her composure while the officers continued their conversation. There was no rush. The truth would come out soon enough. After a few moments of silence, the woman could sense that the officers were starting to grow a little impatient. They seemed ready to wrap up the stop and let her go with a warning or perhaps even a simple ticket. She could hear them muttering between themselves, their tone casual, almost dismissive. It was clear that they weren't expecting anything out of the ordinary. Everything had gone according to their usual plan. And the woman, who had been so calm throughout the entire interaction, was merely another driver in their eyes. But she wasn't just any driver. And now she felt it was time to reveal that. As the officers stood a few steps away from her window, still discussing the details of the stop, the woman took a deep breath. She could feel the weight of the moment, the power of the situation shifting in her favor. She knew that if she didn't speak up soon, they might simply let her go, unaware of who she really was. The thought of them driving away, still believing she was just another civilian, didn't sit right with her. It was time for them to know the truth. With a calm but steady voice, the woman decided to interrupt the officer's conversation. "I think it's time for you to know something," she said, her words cutting through the air. The officers turned, surprised by her sudden statement. She could see the confusion in their eyes as they waited for her to explain what she meant. She allowed the silence to hang in the air for a moment, letting them wonder what was coming next. They were expecting her to explain something small, perhaps where she was headed or why she'd been pulled over, but they were unprepared for what she was about to reveal. "I'm actually the new chief of police in this division," she said, her voice steady and clear. "I was just appointed a few days ago." For a brief moment, everything seemed to stop. The officers stared at her, their faces frozen in shock. The words hung in the air, almost too much for them to process. The silence stretched, as if the world was holding its breath. They had no idea what to say, their minds trying to wrap around what she had just revealed. The woman waited patiently as the officers slowly took in the information. They blinked, first one officer and then the other, as their expressions shifted from confusion to embarrassment. The realization was hitting them slowly, but when it finally dawned on them, they were clearly taken aback. The first officer, who had been the most vocal earlier, cleared his throat, visibly flustered. He fumbled with his words for a moment, trying to find something to say, but no words seemed to come. The second officer, who had been a little quieter, looked around, clearly uncertain of how to handle the situation. They both seemed to realize, in that moment, just how badly they had misjudged her. The woman stayed calm, knowing that it was now up to them to process the situation. There was no anger in her voice, no frustration. She simply allowed them to feel the weight of their mistake. They had assumed things about her based on her appearance, and now they were learning a lesson that would stay with them for a long time. "I think you both know now why I'm not just another civilian," she added, giving them a small nod. Her voice was calm, but powerful. And I hope you'll remember this moment the next time you pull someone over. The officers stood there, silent for a few more seconds, as they processed the situation. It was clear they were trying to figure out what to do next, but there was nothing to be done. The woman had spoken the truth, and now it was up to them to make things right. The tension in the air was palpable, but the woman had made her point. The woman watched the two officers carefully as they tried to process what she had just said. The silence between them seemed to stretch on longer than it should have. She could see the first officer, the one who had asked her most of the questions earlier, visibly squirming. His confidence had vanished, replaced by a mix of embarrassment and uncertainty. He had never imagined that the person he'd just questioned so casually could be someone of such importance. The second officer, a little quieter, seemed equally rattled but didn't know how to respond. He glanced over at his partner, then back at the woman. He cleared his throat and stepped forward slightly, his expression apologetic. "Ma'am, we didn't mean any disrespect," he said, his voice a little shakier now. "We were just doing our job, and we didn't recognize you. I'm sorry." The woman could sense that they were genuinely sorry for their assumptions, but at the same time, she knew this moment was important. It wasn't just about an apology. It was about them realizing something deeper, that they had judged her based on how she looked, without taking the time to understand who she really was. The tension in the air was thick, but she didn't want to make the officers feel cornered or defensive. Instead, she saw this as an opportunity to make them think critically about their actions. She nodded slowly, accepting their apology, but she didn't let the moment pass without giving them something to think about. "I understand," she said, her tone measured and calm. "But it's important to remember that not everyone you meet fits the image you expect. Sometimes, people are more than they seem." The first officer nodded, his gaze now more respectful, though he still seemed a bit lost. He shifted from one foot to the other, clearly unsure of what to do next. The second officer, who had remained more reserved throughout the interaction, seemed to be taking the lesson to heart. He gave the woman a small, respectful nod, his earlier uncertainty replaced with a growing sense of respect. "I think we've made a mistake," the first officer said, his voice more composed now. We should have recognized who you were, and we should have treated you with more respect." The woman gave them both a small, understanding smile. "It's not just about recognizing me. It's about treating everyone with respect, no matter who they are. That's the foundation of good policing." The officers stood there, absorbing her words. They had been taught to follow protocol, to look at situations through a specific lens. But in that moment, they had failed to see the bigger picture. They had let their assumptions cloud their judgment, not just about her, but about how they interacted with people every day. The woman didn't want to hold this over their heads, but she knew the impact this moment would have on them. They had learned a valuable lesson, one that would stay with them far beyond this night. It wasn't about the traffic stop or even the apology. It was about them realizing how easy it was to slip into patterns of judgment based on superficial characteristics. She paused for a moment, watching as the officers processed everything she had said. "Just remember," she continued, "policing isn't just about enforcing the law. It's about understanding the people you serve and showing them respect, no matter who they are. You never know when you'll meet someone who's more than meets the eye." The first officer looked at her, his expression softening. "We won't forget this," he said quietly. "Thank you for handling this the way you did." With that, the woman smiled once more. It wasn't an expression of triumph, but of understanding. She knew that things weren't always as simple as they seemed, and that change didn't come easily. But she also knew that if she could make even one officer think differently, then it was a step in the right direction. As the officers turned and walked back to their patrol car, she stayed in her seat for a moment, taking in what had just happened. She wasn't angry, nor was she offended. She was focused on the bigger picture, knowing that sometimes the most meaningful change came from a quiet, unexpected encounter. She made her point without raising her voice, and in the end, That was all she needed. The news of the traffic stop quickly spread through the police division. Whispers and hushed conversations filled the hallways as officers and staff learned that the woman the two officers had pulled over was, in fact, their new chief of police. The revelation was met with a mix of reactions, ranging from shock to curiosity to embarrassment. It was one thing to be unaware of a superior's identity, but it was another to realize they had failed to show the proper respect. The more the story spread, the more uncomfortable it made everyone involved. The two officers who had conducted the stop were now the subject of quiet discussions. They had been so certain that they were just doing their job, following routine procedures. But as more officers heard about the incident, they began to realize just how wrong they had been. It wasn't about the mistake they had made. It was about how easily they had fallen into assumptions about the woman. They had failed to treat her with the respect she deserved, and now they had to face the consequences of their actions. The woman, however, wasn't angry. She wasn't looking for revenge or a public reprimand. She simply saw this as an opportunity to make a point, one that would hopefully resonate with everyone involved. She knew that change didn't come through force, but through understanding. Her leadership was about more than just authority. It was about setting an example for those around her, showing them how to be better, how to think beyond appearances, and how to approach every person with dignity. That afternoon, she decided it was time to address the officers directly. She called for a meeting in the department's conference room, where all the officers who had been involved in the stop were asked to gather. The room was quiet when she walked in, her presence commanding attention without a word. There were no harsh glares or angry speeches, just a calm, measured approach. The officers, including the two who had stopped her, sat in a row, visibly uncomfortable as they waited for the woman to speak. They could feel the weight of the situation hanging in the air, knowing they were about to hear something important. They all knew that something needed to change, and now it was time to hear it from the chief herself. The woman took her place at the front of the room, her voice calm but firm. "I don't want to dwell on what happened," she began, her eyes scanning the room, making sure each officer was paying attention. "But I want to make something clear. The way we treat others is everything. Every day, we are in a position of power, a position that demands respect, fairness, and understanding. It doesn't matter who we interact with, whether they're a civilian on the street, a colleague, or someone we don't recognize. We must treat everyone with dignity." She paused for a moment, letting her words sink in. The officers remained quiet, absorbing what she was saying. The two officers who had been involved in the traffic stop exchanged glances, clearly reflecting on the impact of the conversation. "This isn't just about me," the chief continued. "It's about how we approach our work. Biases and assumptions have no place in law enforcement. We're supposed to serve and protect everyone, no matter their background or appearance. And when we fail to do that, we fail not just as officers, but as human beings." The room was still. The officers sat in silence, some with their heads lowered, others deep in thought. It was clear that the message had hit home, and the chief could see that she was making a difference. She didn't need to lecture them. They were already realizing the importance of what she was saying. "I know it's not always easy," she said, her tone softening slightly. "We all have our biases. Our experiences shape how we see the world. But we can choose how we act, and we must act with respect for everyone we meet, no matter what we think we know about them." The chief let her words hang in the air, allowing the officers to process them. There were no quick fixes, no immediate solutions, but change had started, and that was what mattered. As the meeting came to a close, the officers filed out, their expressions thoughtful. They knew they had just been given a valuable lesson, one that would shape their interactions moving forward. And for the chief, this was just the beginning. She knew that with time, the division would grow stronger, more respectful, more aware, and more united in its mission to serve the community. The next few days at the department were a time of quiet reflection. Officers went about their usual duties, but there was a noticeable shift in the way they interacted with each other and with the public. The chief's words had resonated with them more than they'd expected, and they were beginning to understand the deeper meaning of her message. It wasn't just about respect for their new leader. It was about a broader understanding of how they needed to treat everyone with the same dignity and fairness. The two officers who had been involved in the traffic stop seemed to carry the weight of the lesson with them wherever they went. They had changed. Their interactions with fellow officers and with civilians had become more mindful, more thoughtful. They now understood that they couldn't let assumptions dictate their actions, especially when they had the power to make or break someone's day with a simple gesture. And while they were still learning, they began to hold themselves accountable in a way they hadn't before. One morning, the first officer who had spoken to the chief approached her in the hallway. He had a hesitant look on his face, but there was something genuine in his eyes. "Ma'am," he said, his voice quieter than usual. "I just wanted to say, I've been thinking about what you said, about how we treat people. I didn't realize how much I took that for granted before." The woman, who had been walking briskly, stopped and turned to face him. She could tell he was sincere. "I'm glad you're reflecting on it," she said calmly. "It's not easy to change the way we think, but it's important. We all have biases, but we need to be aware of them. It's part of growing, as both officers and people." He nodded, the weight of the conversation still heavy in his mind. "Thank you. I'll keep that in mind every time I'm on the job." The woman smiled slightly. "I appreciate that. Keep learning and keep being aware." As the days went by, the chief began to implement some changes within the department. She started by organizing training sessions focused on understanding biases and learning how to recognize and confront them. She didn't want to stop at just one conversation. She wanted this to be a turning point for the entire division. She was determined to foster a culture of respect and awareness, where every officer, regardless of their background, would understand the importance of treating people fairly. The officers who had been part of the traffic stop, as well as others in the division, began to attend the new training. The chief knew that change wouldn't happen overnight, but this was the first step toward a more inclusive, understanding department. As the training went on, the officers participated fully, asking questions and sharing their own experiences. It was clear that the conversation had opened their eyes to things they hadn't noticed before. One day, the chief stood in front of the group as they discussed various scenarios. She could see the difference in their attitudes. They were no longer just talking about policies or protocols. They were talking about people. They were thinking about how their actions could impact someone's life, and they were beginning to understand the responsibility they held as public servants. It wasn't just about the law. It was about humanity. And for the chief, that was the key to making lasting change. She wanted her officers to be leaders, not just in their uniforms, but in how they treated the world around them. As the training sessions continued, the chief found herself feeling more hopeful. She saw real progress, not just in the officers' behavior, but in the way they viewed their work. They were starting to embrace the idea that their job was not only about enforcing the law, but also about upholding the values of fairness, respect, and integrity. The road to change would take time, but the chief was certain that her department was on the right path, and that made every challenge, every moment of discomfort, worth it. The impact of that simple traffic stop, where they learned a valuable lesson about assumptions and respect, would shape the division for years to come. The transformation in the department was evident. Officers, once unaware of how their biases affected their interactions with others, were now becoming more conscious of the way they approached every situation. The chief's leadership had ignited something in them, a desire to do better, not just as officers, but as human beings. They had learned that their actions mattered, that how they treated people could leave lasting impressions, and they were slowly building a stronger, more respectful department. The chief had made it clear from the beginning that change would take time, and she was patient. She knew that meaningful reform wasn't a quick fix. It required a deep commitment from everyone involved. So she kept pushing forward, implementing more training, offering support and encouraging open dialogue. She made it clear that she was available for any officer who wanted to discuss their concerns or struggles, and many took her up on that offer. One afternoon, a small group of officers gathered for a discussion after a particularly difficult day. They sat around a table, each one reflecting on the changes they had experienced over the past few weeks. The chief had spoken to them about understanding biases and questioning their own assumptions, but it had taken time for those lessons to sink in fully. Some officers had even begun to notice when they slipped back into old habits, and they were learning how to catch themselves before making a mistake. One officer, a young woman who had only recently joined the department, spoke up. "I think the hardest part for me has been realizing how much I didn't see before," she said thoughtfully. "I thought I treated everyone fairly, but there were times when I just assumed things about people without even realizing it. I'm still trying to unlearn those habits." Her words struck a chord with the group. Everyone around the table nodded in agreement, each of them reflecting on their own experiences. It wasn't easy to admit mistakes, but there was a sense of camaraderie in the room. They all knew they were in this together, working toward a common goal of becoming better officers, better people. "It's not about being perfect," one of the senior officers added. "It's about recognizing when we make mistakes and taking steps to do better next time. We've all been there, but as long as we keep trying, we're moving in the right direction." The conversation continued, with each officer sharing their thoughts on how they had changed since the chief's speech. They talked about their experiences on the streets, how they now looked at their interactions with civilians in a new light. There were more conversations about patience and understanding, about not rushing to judgment. And slowly they realized that the work they were doing was about so much more than enforcing the law. It was about building trust within the community and creating positive relationships. As the weeks went by, the department began to see the fruits of their efforts. There were fewer misunderstandings on the job, fewer assumptions made. Officers started to approach situations with more empathy and consideration, and the community began to notice too. People began to speak more openly about their experiences with the department, and many remarked on how they felt a new sense of respect from the officers they encountered. The chief saw the positive changes unfolding before her, but she knew that there was still more work to be done. She kept pushing her officers, not out of a desire to prove anything, but because she knew they were capable of even more. She believed in their ability to grow and improve, and she would continue to challenge them to be better every day. One evening, after a particularly difficult but successful training session, the chief walked through the department with a sense of quiet satisfaction. She could see it in the officers' faces, the pride they now felt in the work they were doing. It wasn't perfect yet, but it was progress, and that was what mattered. She knew that as long as they kept working together, the department would continue to evolve. It was a long journey, but with each small step forward, the chief saw the future of her department taking shape, a department built on respect, understanding, and the kind of leadership that inspired real change. The days that followed were a reminder of how much potential the department had for growth. The chief's efforts to instill a sense of accountability and understanding were beginning to show results. It wasn't just the officers who were changing. The entire culture of the department was starting to shift. More officers were beginning to approach their work with a renewed sense of purpose, and the community, too, was noticing the difference. As time passed, the chief continued to lead by example. She remained calm and composed, always encouraging her officers to think before acting and to recognize the power of their positions. She made sure that each lesson learned from the traffic stop wasn't lost in the hustle of everyday duties. Every opportunity for growth was seized, whether it was in a meeting, during a routine traffic stop, or in a conversation with a civilian. She encouraged her team to approach every interaction with the same level of respect they would expect for themselves. A few months after the incident, there was a town hall meeting where the chief spoke to the public about the department's commitment to improvement. She addressed the community directly, acknowledging the trust they had placed in the police and the work still to be done. Her words were filled with sincerity, and her determination was evident in every sentence. She spoke about the department's ongoing efforts to address bias, improve training, and foster better relationships with the community. Her speech was well received, with many members of the community nodding in agreement, appreciative of the transparency and honesty in her words. Change isn't easy, the chief told the crowd, but it's necessary. It's something we must all commit to, not just as officers, but as individuals. We are all part of this community, and it's our duty to make sure that every person, no matter who they are, feels safe and respected. Her words resonated deeply with the crowd. People came up to her afterward, thanking her for her leadership and for taking the time to engage with the community. It was a moment of connection, a reminder that police work wasn't just about enforcement. It was about service, about being a part of something bigger than oneself. Back at the department, the officers continued to put into practice the lessons they had learned. They began to approach their work with a more empathetic mindset, remembering the chief's advice about looking beyond appearances. There were still challenges to face, and mistakes were made, but the department had taken a significant step in the right direction. The officers were no longer just performing their duties. They were becoming active participants in building a stronger, more unified community. The chief watched all of this unfold with a quiet sense of pride. She knew that the road ahead would still be difficult, but she also knew that her officers were now more equipped to handle it. They were no longer just focused on the law. They were focused on people. They were learning to be more mindful of their interactions, to understand that everyone they met had a story, and that everyone deserved respect. As the chief walked through the department one evening, she took a moment to reflect on how far they had come. It had started with a simple but powerful lesson, a lesson that had changed not only the two officers involved but the entire department. She knew that the true test would come in the months and years ahead, but for now, she felt confident in the direction they were headed. It wasn't just about enforcing the law. It was about creating a department that was truly connected to the people it served. The chief knew that as long as her officers kept learning, kept growing, and kept working together, the department would continue to build a stronger, more trusting relationship with the community. And that, she thought, was what real leadership was all about.